This wasn't supposed to happen, the moment that shocked everyone. The studio lights were warm, almost comforting, the kind that make everything feel rehearsed, safe, predictable. The audience had settled in, applause still echoing from the opening theme, and the hosts wore their practiced smiles like armor. This was supposed to be another polished daytime segment, another celebrity interview, another friendly conversation that would drift by and be forgotten by dinner. But something in Sophie Turner's eyes said otherwise. Before we go any further, if you love intense celebrity moments, real tension, and stories that explode when no one expects them to, make sure you subscribe to Prime Talk, hit that like button, and drop a comment right now. Because what you're about to hear, nobody in that studio was ready for it. Sophie sat tall in her chair, legs crossed, hands folded neatly in her lap. Calm. Composed. Almost too calm. The kind of calm that comes right before a storm breaks. Across from her, Whoopi Goldberg leaned back with that familiar, unbothered confidence she's known for. The conversation had started light. Career updates, life after massive fame, motherhood, growth. The audience laughed at the right moments. The hosts nodded along. Everything followed the script. Until it didn't. It started with a question that sounded harmless enough. Whoopi tilted her head slightly, eyes narrowing with curiosity, and said something about fame arriving too young, about pressure, about mistakes made in the public eye. Her tone wasn't harsh, but there was an edge to it, a subtle implication hanging in the air. Sophie's smile tightened. You could almost see the moment she decided not to let it slide. She inhaled slowly, her eyes flicking toward the audience for just a split second before returning to Whoopi. I think it's interesting, she said softly, how people talk about mistakes when they've never had to grow up with cameras following their every move. The room shifted. A few audience members stirred. The co-hosts exchanged quick glances. Whoopi raised an eyebrow. That's not what I meant, she replied, her voice calm but firmer now. It's just part of the business. Everyone in this industry gets criticized. Sophie leaned forward. Not like that, she said. The words landed heavier than anyone expected. Her voice didn't shake, but there was something underneath it, years of swallowed frustration finally pushing its way out. She adjusted in her seat, uncrossed her legs, and for the first time, the polished celebrity mask slipped. When you're 18, Sophie continued, and the whole world decides who you are before you even know it yourself, that's not just criticism. That's survival. A ripple went through the audience. You could hear someone whisper, "Oh wow." Whoopi's expression shifted, just slightly. She opened her mouth to respond, then paused. The silence stretched a beat too long. That's fair, Whoopi said carefully. But people are allowed to talk about what they see. Sophie nodded. Slowly, deliberately. And I'm allowed to respond, she said. Especially when the narrative keeps getting twisted. The air felt heavier now. Cameras subtly zoomed in. The producers could feel it. The moment was slipping out of their control. Sophie's voice grew steadier, stronger. 4 years, I stayed quiet. I let people assume things about my marriage, my parenting, my choices. I watched headlines turn into facts just because nobody corrected them. She looked directly at Whoopi now. And sometimes, she added, those assumptions come from people who should know better. The audience gasped. Not loud, but sharp enough to be heard. Whoopi blinked. Once. Twice. Her smile was gone. Are you saying I'm one of those people? She asked. The tension snapped tight like a wire about to break. Sophie didn't hesitate. I'm saying that when powerful voices speak casually about someone's life, it carries weight, she replied. And I've carried that weight for a long time. You could feel the room holding its breath. One of the co-hosts tried to jump in, her voice light and nervous. Okay, let's. But Sophie wasn't done. There's this idea, she continued, eyes shining now, that young women in this industry should just take it. Smile through it. Laugh it off. Be grateful. But at some point, you realize silence only protects the people doing the judging. The audience broke into scattered applause before quickly quieting, unsure if they were even allowed to react. Whoopi leaned forward now, elbows on the table. Her voice dropped, controlled but firm. I've been in this business a long time, she said. And I've taken my hits too. Nobody gets a free pass. Sophie met her gaze, unflinching. I'm not asking for a free pass, she said. I'm asking for fairness. That word hung in the air. Fairness. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The cameras cut between their faces. 2 generations, 2 worlds, colliding live on television. The tension wasn't loud. It was worse. It was quiet. Raw. Real. Somewhere in the audience, someone shifted uncomfortably. A producer could be seen off-camera gesturing urgently. This was not in the rundown. This was not rehearsed. And then Sophie said something that changed everything. "You know what hurt the most?" she asked softly. Not the headlines. Not the rumors. It was realizing how easily people I admired believed them. The words landed like a punch. Whoopi's jaw tightened. For a moment, it looked like she might fire back. Instead, she exhaled slowly. "That's not my intention," she said. "But I hear you." The way she said it, measured, careful, only fueled the tension further. Because to Sophie, it didn't sound like enough. Her voice dropped, quieter now, but somehow more powerful. "Then please," she said, "actually listen." The studio fell completely silent. No music. No laughter. No cue cards to save the moment. Just two women, locked in a stare that felt far more personal than anyone had signed up for. And as the camera slowly pulled back, the audience could sense it. This wasn't over. Not even close. Because what Sophie was about to say next would send shockwaves far beyond that studio, lighting up social media, dividing fans, and forcing everyone watching to pick a side. The silence didn't just linger, it thickened. You could feel it pressing down on the studio, wrapping around every person in the room. Even the lights felt harsher now, exposing every flicker of emotion on every face. Sophie sat perfectly still, but her hands were clenched tightly in her lap. Across from her, Whoopi shifted in her chair, her legendary composure tested in a way few had ever seen on live television. The host who usually steered conversations back to safety cleared her throat, trying to regain control. "So, Sophie, your new project." But Sophie gently shook her head. "No," she said quietly. "I think this matters more." A murmur rippled through the audience. Whoopi turned toward her fully now. "All right," she said, voice even. "Then let's talk about it." And just like that, the line had been crossed. Sophie took a breath, slow and deliberate, as if grounding herself before stepping off a cliff. Her eyes shimmered, not with tears, but with something sharper, resolve. "When I was younger," she began, "I didn't have the language to defend myself. I didn't know how to push back without being labeled difficult, ungrateful, or dramatic." She paused, glancing briefly at the crowd. "So I stayed quiet. I smiled. I let people tell my story for me." Whoopi listened, arms crossed now, her face unreadable. "But then," Sophie continued, her voice gaining strength, "I watched people dissect my life like entertainment. My marriage. My body. My mental health. And I realized, silence doesn't protect you. It invites more noise." The audience erupted in applause before quickly dying down again. The energy in the room was electric, uncomfortable, raw. Whoopi leaned forward. "I get that," she said. "But criticism comes with visibility. That's not new." Sophie nodded slowly. "Criticism, yes. Misrepresentation. No. That's when it happened." She turned fully toward Whoopi, eyes locked. "There were moments," Sophie said, carefully choosing each word, "when commentary from shows like this one shaped public opinion about me in ways that weren't fair. And I had to live with that." The words hit harder than any accusation shouted ever could. A sharp intake of breath echoed from somewhere in the audience. Whoopi's eyes narrowed slightly. "Are you saying this show hurt you?" Sophie didn't look away. "I'm saying it contributed." For a split second, time froze. You could see it on Whoopi's face, the flicker of surprise, the calculation, the restraint. She had been challenged before, but rarely this directly, and never with this much emotional weight behind it. "Well," Whoopi said finally, her tone shifting, "that was never the intention." "I know," Sophie replied quickly. "But impact matters more than intention." That line landed like thunder. The co-hosts exchanged glances, unsure whether to jump in or let the moment breathe. The producer off-camera gestured urgently, but nobody moved. The conversation had taken on a life of its own. Sophie's voice softened, but the intensity didn't fade. "I watched interviews back years later," she said, "and I barely recognized myself. Not because I'd changed, but because the story being told about me wasn't mine." Her hands trembled slightly now, the emotion finally surfacing. And when you're young, you believe it. You start questioning yourself. You start thinking maybe you really are the problem. A hush fell over the room. Even Whoopi looked momentarily shaken. "That's not something anyone should go through," Whoopi admitted quietly. But people do, Sophie replied. Every day. Especially women. Especially young women. The audience burst into applause again, louder this time, some standing instinctively before sitting back down, realizing the moment was still unfolding. Whoopi exhaled slowly, nodding. You're right about that. For a brief second, it seemed like the tension might ease. Like this might turn into a moment of understanding. Then Sophie said something that changed the temperature entirely. But what hurt most, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, was realizing how easy it was for people to believe the worst about me without ever asking if I was okay. The words hung in the air, heavy and unshakable. Whoopi's expression shifted again, this time, a flicker of defensiveness flashing through. Let me ask you something, she said. Do you think people like me are responsible for protecting celebrities from public opinion? Sophie hesitated for just a moment. I think people with platforms are responsible for remembering there's a human being on the other side, she replied. The audience gasped audibly. One of the co-hosts leaned forward, eyes wide. Okay, let's. But Whoopi raised a hand, stopping her. No, she said. Let her finish. Sophie looked surprised, but grateful. I'm not here to attack you, she said. I'm here because I'm tired of pretending these moments didn't affect me. They did. Deeply. Her voice cracked slightly, the first sign of vulnerability breaking through the controlled exterior. And I know I'm not the only one watching right now who's felt misunderstood, talked over, or judged by people who never asked their side. The room felt impossibly still. Even the cameras seemed to hesitate. Whoopi's voice softened. That wasn't my intention, she said again, more sincerely this time. But I hear you. Sophie nodded slowly, eyes glistening. I hope so, she replied. Because I'm done being quiet. The audience erupted into applause, loud, sustained, emotional. But beneath the clapping, beneath the nods and murmurs, something else lingered. This wasn't resolution. This was ignition. And as the show prepared to cut to commercial, one thing was painfully clear. What had just happened on that stage was only the beginning. Because outside that studio, millions were already watching, replaying, dissecting, and getting ready to choose sides. The applause faded, but the tension didn't. It lingered in the air like static after a lightning strike, impossible to ignore. The camera pulled back as the show cut to commercial, but the energy inside the studio didn't reset the way it usually did. There was no easy laughter, no whispered jokes between hosts. Even the crew moved differently now, careful, alert, aware that something irreversible had just happened. When the cameras came back on, the atmosphere had changed. Sophie sat straighter, her shoulders squared, as if she'd crossed a line she could never uncross. Whoopi, on the other hand, looked contemplative, her expression tighter, more guarded. The audience, once relaxed and chatty, sat in near silence, waiting for the next word like it might detonate. The red light blinked on. And just like that, they were live again. Whoopi broke the silence first, her voice calm but noticeably lower. We're back, she said, glancing briefly at the camera before turning back to Sophie. And I think this is an important conversation. Sophie nodded, but didn't smile. I do too, she said. There was something different about her now. The hesitation was gone. Whatever fear had held her back before had burned away in the heat of the moment. Whoopi leaned back slightly. You said something before the break that stuck with me, she continued. About people believing the worst without asking if you were okay. Sophie exhaled slowly. Because that's what happened. She paused, gathering herself. There were nights, she said quietly, when I'd go home and replay interviews in my head, wondering what I'd done wrong. Wondering why people seemed so eager to paint me as something I wasn't. The audience listened in absolute silence. And the hardest part, she added, I started believing them. A ripple of emotion moved through the room. Someone in the front row wiped their eyes. Whoopi's expression softened, but there was still tension there. That's not something anyone should carry alone, she said. No, Sophie agreed. But when you're young and famous, you don't always realize you're allowed to push back. She looked directly at Whoopi again. Until now. That single word landed like a challenge. Whoopi inhaled deeply. You know, she said slowly, people expect us to have opinions. That's our job. But sometimes the line between commentary and harm gets blurred. Sophie nodded. Exactly. And when that line gets crossed, it sticks with you longer than people realize. The audience murmured in agreement. Then Whoopi said something that shifted the tone once again. I want to be honest with you, she said. When you first came up, I thought you were tough. Like you could handle anything. Sophie's lips pressed together. And that, she replied, is the problem. The room froze. Being strong doesn't mean being invincible, Sophie continued. It doesn't mean words don't hurt. It doesn't mean you don't go home and cry after pretending you're fine all day. Her voice trembled, just slightly. I shouldn't have had to prove I was hurting for it to matter. That was the moment everything changed. The audience erupted, not in applause this time, but in raw reaction. Gasps. Whispers. Someone softly said, "Wow." Whoopi blinked, visibly processing what she'd just heard. "I hear you," she said quietly. "And I'm sorry if anything I've said in the past contributed to that." The apology wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But it was real. Sophie looked stunned. For a moment, she didn't respond. Then she nodded slowly. "Thank you," she said. "That means more than you know." The tension shifted again, but it didn't disappear. It transformed, less combative, more emotional. The kind of moment that only happens when walls finally come down. But the audience wasn't done reacting. A few people began clapping. Others followed. Soon, the room was filled with applause, not celebratory, but supportive. Acknowledging something raw and unfiltered unfolding in real time. Whoopi glanced around the studio, then back at Sophie. "You're right about one thing," she said. "We all need to do better. Me included." Sophie exhaled, a weight visibly lifting from her shoulders. "I'm not here to attack anyone," she said softly. "I just don't want the next young woman to sit where I sat and feel like she has to stay silent." The words echoed long after she finished speaking. The co-hosts finally stepped in, gently steering the conversation toward safer ground, but the energy never fully recovered. Something had cracked open, and everyone could feel it. As the segment wrapped up, the camera caught Sophie and Whoopi sharing a brief look, complicated, layered, unresolved, but honest. And when the applause faded and the lights dimmed, the real fallout began. Because outside that studio, phones were already lighting up. Clips were being clipped. Tweets were being written. Headlines were forming before the show even ended. And by the time the credits rolled, one thing was undeniable. This wasn't just another celebrity interview. It was a moment that would be replayed, debated, defended, and dissected for days to come. And the world was only just beginning to react. By the time the show went to commercial for the final time, the damage and the impact had already been done. Backstage, the energy was nothing like it had been an hour earlier. Producers whispered urgently into headsets. Assistants hurried past with phones in hand, eyes wide as notifications flooded their screens. Someone muttered, "It's already trending," under their breath. And they weren't wrong. Within minutes, clips of the exchange were everywhere. Twitter, now X, was exploding. TikTok edits were being uploaded in real time. Headlines began forming before the episode had even finished airing. Sophie Turner calls out Whoopi Goldberg live. Viewers stunned by on-air confrontation. Raw moment leaves audience speechless. Inside the studio, Sophie sat quietly, her hands wrapped around a paper cup of water she hadn't touched. The adrenaline was wearing off now, replaced by something heavier, relief mixed with uncertainty. She'd said what she needed to say. But once words are released into the world, there's no pulling them back. Across the room, Whoopi stood with a producer, her expression unreadable. She nodded slowly as someone spoke to her, then glanced toward Sophie. Their eyes met briefly. No anger, no resentment, just understanding, and maybe a hint of respect. The cameras were off, but the moment was far from over. Because outside that building, millions of people were already choosing sides. Some praised Sophie for her bravery, for finally saying what so many young actors were afraid to say. Clips of her saying impact matters more than intention were being shared everywhere, captioned with fire emojis and applause. Others rushed to defend Whoopi, calling her a veteran, a truth teller, someone who had earned the right to speak freely. Comment sections turned into battlegrounds. And then came the think pieces. Articles dissected every word, every pause, every look exchanged between the two women. Experts weighed in on power dynamics, generational gaps, media responsibility. Psychologists talked about the toll of fame. Fans debated whether Sophie had planned the moment, or if it had simply spilled out after years of silence. But what no headline could fully capture was how real it had been. Because for Sophie, this wasn't a performance. It was years of swallowed emotions finally finding air. Later that night, as the episode replayed across different time zones, Sophie posted a single message on her social media. No long explanation. No defense. Just one line. Speaking your truth is scary, but staying silent is worse. The post went viral within minutes. Meanwhile, Whoopi addressed the moment the following day in a brief but measured statement. She didn't deflect. She didn't dismiss it. Instead, she said something that surprised a lot of people. Sometimes conversations make us uncomfortable because they are supposed to. Growth isn't easy. That line alone shifted the narrative. What started as a confrontation slowly turned into something else, an uncomfortable but necessary dialogue about fame, pressure, and the cost of being constantly watched. And the audience? They couldn't stop talking about it. Some said Sophie had changed the game. Others said the moment proved how deeply personal media can become. But almost everyone agreed on one thing. They felt it, because it didn't feel scripted. It didn't feel manufactured. It didn't feel safe. It felt human. Days later, clips of the exchange were still circulating. Reaction videos piled up. Comment sections were flooded with stories from people who saw themselves in Sophie's words. People who had stayed quiet too long, afraid of being labeled difficult, dramatic, or ungrateful. And in a strange way, that might have been the most powerful outcome of all. Not the confrontation, not the headlines, not the viral moment, but the fact that one conversation, on one stage, reminded people that even celebrities, especially celebrities, carry scars we don't see. And that sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is speak. Now I want to hear from you. Do you think Sophie was right to call it out live? Or do you think some conversations should stay behind the scenes? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If this moment shook you the way it shook the internet, make sure you like this video, share it with someone who needs to see it, and subscribe to Prime Talk for more explosive, emotional, and unforgettable stories like this one. Because here, we don't just report the moment. We take you inside it,